The year was 1889, and the granite bones of the mountains held a cold that seeped into a man's soul. For Arthur Blackwood, the cold was an old acquaintance. It lived not just in the biting wind that scoured his isolated claim, but inside him, a permanent winter that had set in 5 years prior. His life was a stark and brutal rhythm, the clang of the pickaxe against stubborn rock, the grit of dust in his throat, the taste of beans and stale coffee, and the vast, crushing silence of the high country. His cabin was less a home than a burrow, a place to weather the nights and the ghosts that came with them. It was a shelter built of rough-hewn logs and chinked with mud and sorrow, containing little more than a cot, a cold stove, and a single faded daguerreotype on a small crate next to his bed. Grief, he had learned, had weight. It was the heaviness in his shoulders as he swung the axe, the drag in his feet as he hauled ore to the sluice box. He had come to these mountains not to seek his fortune, but to lose himself in hardship, to punish his body until the ache in his muscles could shout down the ache in his heart. He had once been a man with a wife, a son, a life that was soft at the edges. Now, all that remained of that man was a hollowed-out shell, a figure who spoke only to his mule, and whose only companion was the echo of his own breathing in the thin air. The claim, inherited from a distant uncle, yielded just enough gold to keep him in beans and blasting powder. It was a penance, not a living. He was hauling a bucket of water from the creek, the icy handle burning his calloused palm when he first saw her. She was a flicker of movement at the edge of the pines, so out of place in the unforgiving landscape that he thought she might be a figment, another trick of the light and loneliness. But she was real. She moved with a desperate, halting gait, one hand clutching the thin fabric of her shawl, the other holding tight to the small hand of a boy who stumbled beside her. As they drew closer, he could see the exhaustion etched onto her face, the deep, dark smudges beneath her eyes, and the fear that made her seem brittle, as if a sharp word could shatter her. She stopped a dozen feet from him, her chest heaving. The boy, whose face was flushed with an unnatural heat, leaned against her, his breathing a shallow, rasping sound that was painfully loud in the quiet of the canyon. The woman was young, perhaps younger than his own 28 years, but hardship had aged her, scraped away any softness. Her dress was worn, her shoes were a ruin. Arthur stood frozen, the bucket handle digging into his flesh. People did not come here. In 2 years, he had not seen another soul on his land. His solitude was a fortress, and she was standing at the gate. He set the bucket down with a thud, the sound harsh and unwelcoming. "This is private property," he said. His voice was a rusty tool, stiff from disuse. The woman flinched but did not retreat. She swallowed, her gaze flicking from his hard face to the plume of smoke rising from his cabin's chimney. "I know, I'm sorry. We have nowhere else." Her voice was thin, but it held a thread of steel. She pulled the boy a little closer, a gesture of fierce, hopeless protection. "My son, he's sick. The doctor in Carbon Creek says it's lung fever. He needs medicine, strong medicine." Arthur's face remained a mask of stone. "The town is a day's walk that way," he grunted, jerking his chin back the way she had come. "I'm not a doctor." "The town has no charity for us," she said, a bitter edge to her words. "My husband, he passed a month ago. The fever took him too. I've sold everything we had. There's nothing left. The doctor, Mr. Hale, he won't give credit." She took a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that was unsettling. It was the look of an animal trapped, willing to do anything to get free. "I will be your servant," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "For life. I can cook, clean, mend. I can work. I am strong. I will do anything you ask, no questions. All I ask, all I am begging for, is the medicine for my child, please." The offer hung in the air between them, stark and shocking, a servant for life. The words conjured images of bondage, of a desperation so profound it was willing to sell a future for a single night's reprieve from death. Arthur stared at her, then at the boy, who let out a weak, rattling cough that shook his small frame. The sound was a key turning a lock deep inside Arthur's chest, opening a door he had long since nailed shut. It was the same cough, the same shallow, labored breathing. He saw not this strange boy, but his own son, Thomas, in the final days. He felt the phantom weight of a small, hot body in his arms. He turned away, the memory a physical blow. "I don't need a servant," he snarled, the words harsher than he intended. "Please," she whispered, and the sound was so broken it was barely human. He heard her sink to her knees, the soft thud of her body on the hard-packed earth. "His name is Leo. He is only 6. Arthur stood with his back to her, his hands clenched into fists. The mountains watched, silent and indifferent. The wind howled like a thing grieving. He was a man who had fled from feeling, who had built a life on the foundation of being left alone, and now, life, in its cruel and persistent way, had come knocking. He could send her away. He could let the wilderness and the fever run their course. It was not his burden. But as he stood there, he knew he couldn't. The ghost of one child was enough for any man to carry. He could not bear the weight of a second. Without turning, without another word, he stalked toward his cabin. He threw open the door, grabbed his worn coat and the small deerskin pouch where he kept his gold dust and the few coins he'd amassed. He strode back out, not looking at the woman still kneeling on the ground. "Get the boy inside by the stove," he commanded, his voice rough. "There's wood in the box. Keep it fed. Don't let it go out." He saw the flash of disbelief, and then dawning, desperate hope on her face. She scrambled to her feet, pulling the boy with her. "What is your name?" he asked, his back already half turned toward the trail. "Clara," she answered, her voice trembling. "Clara McBride." He just nodded, a curt, dismissive gesture, and started walking. He did not look back. The journey to Carbon Creek was a descent into a world he had abandoned. It was a full day of hard walking, his mind a turmoil of anger and a strange, unwelcome resurgence of purpose. He was angry at the woman for her intrusion, angry at the world for its cruelty, and most of all, angry at himself for the weakness that was making him do this. He was a fool. He was spending what little security he had on a stranger's child, on a promise as wild and desperate as the woman who had made it. Carbon Creek was a gash in the landscape, a raw collection of clapboard buildings clinging to the side of a gorge. It smelled of coal smoke, cheap whiskey, and desperation. He went straight to the small office of Dr. Hale, a man whose clean collar and soft hands seemed an affront to the grimy world around him. "Blackwood," the doctor said, surprised. "Didn't expect to see you down from your mountain." "I need medicine. For lung fever. A child," Arthur stated, wasting no words. Dr. Hale raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something curiosity, suspicion in his eyes. "A child? I didn't know you had." "It's not for me," Arthur cut him off. "It's for the McBride boy. His mother is at my cabin." A look of faint distaste crossed the doctor's face. "Ah, yes, the widow. A sad case. But I'm afraid my charity has its limits, Mr. Blackwood. Medicine costs money." "I'm not asking for charity," Arthur said, his voice flat. He untied the deerskin pouch and poured a small, shimmering pile of gold dust onto the man's desk. It was nearly all he had. "Is this enough?" The doctor's eyes widened slightly. He carefully scooped the dust onto his scales, his movements precise. He weighed it, did a quick calculation on a scrap of paper, and nodded. "Yes, this will be sufficient for the medicine and a small amount of my trouble." He disappeared into a back room, the clinking of glass bottles echoing in the small office. Arthur stood waiting, his jaw tight. He felt the eyes of the town on him as he left the doctor's office with a small, tightly wrapped parcel. He bought flour, bacon, and a small sack of dried apples from Weston's Mercantile, the purchase depleting the last of his coins. He ignored the whispers and the curious stares. Let them talk. He was already turning his back on their world, heading back to the isolation of his mountain, but this time he knew it would not be the same. The silence he was returning to was no longer empty. It now held two strangers. The climb back was arduous, fueled by a grim determination. Night had fallen by the time he saw the faint, welcoming glow of light in his cabin window. It was a sight he had not seen in years, a light where there should only be darkness. It sent a strange, unsettling pang through his chest. He pushed the door open to a scene that stopped him in his tracks. The small, cluttered space had been transformed. His dirty tin plates were washed and stacked. The floor had been swept clean of mud and rock dust. A pot of something that was not beans simmered on the stove, filling the cabin with a savory aroma. Clara sat in his only chair, pulled close to the fire. The boy, Leo, was asleep on Arthur's cot, tucked beneath his own rough wool blanket, his breathing still labored but seemingly less ragged. She shot to her feet the moment he entered, her hands twisting in the fabric of her dress. "You came back," she breathed, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and awe. Arthur grunted, shrugging off his coat. He placed the parcel of medicine and the sack of provisions on the table without ceremony. "I said I would." He looked at the sleeping boy. "How is he?" "The warmth helps. He drank some water," she said, her gaze fixed on the parcel. "Is that?" He nodded, unwrapping the bottle of dark liquid and the doctor's handwritten instructions. "Twice a day, a spoonful." She took the bottle with hands that trembled, cradling it as if it were the most precious object on earth. She measured out a dose with painstaking care and gently woke the boy. Leo coughed and whimpered, but she soothed him with a soft murmur, tipping the medicine into his mouth. He swallowed and fell back into a restless sleep. Clara stood watching her son, her shoulders slumped with a weariness that went bone deep. She finally turned back to Arthur, her expression one of solemn gravity. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick. "I will honor my word. I am your servant." Arthur felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. He looked around the small, clean cabin, at the simmering pot on the stove, at the woman whose presence filled the space that had been empty for so long. He didn't want a servant. The very idea was a weight he had no wish to carry. But he was too tired to argue, too raw from the journey and the memories it had stirred. "There's stew," she offered quietly. "I found some root vegetables you'd stored." He merely nodded, took the bowl she offered, and sat on a crate, his back to her. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the rasp of the sick boy's breath. The stew was better than anything he had eaten in years. He finished the bowl, set it down, and stood up. "You and the boy can take the cot," he said, his voice gruff. He gestured toward the thin pallet of straw and burlap sacks he'd made for them near the hearth. "I'll sleep there." "No, I couldn't," she started to protest. "It's my cabin," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. He grabbed a spare blanket and settled himself on the floor without another glance in her direction. He lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person's breathing. He felt Clara settle onto the cot, her small weight barely making the ropes creak. The bargain was sealed. The fortress of his solitude had been breached, and he did not know if it was a surrender or a rescue. The days that followed fell into a strange new pattern. Arthur rose before dawn, as he always did, and went to his mine. The familiar labor, a comfort in its mind, numbing repetition. But now, when he returned at dusk, caked in mud and exhausted, the cabin was warm. There was food on the stove. His world, once a monochrome of grey and brown, now had a flicker of color in it, a life that was not his own. Clara was a tireless, silent presence. She moved about the small cabin with a quiet efficiency that was almost ghostly. She scrubbed the floors, mended the tears in his worn shirts with thread she had painstakingly unraveled from the hem of her own petticoat, and stretched their meager provisions with a skill that bordered on miraculous. She never spoke unless spoken to, and her eyes were always downcast. She was upholding her end of the bargain with a fierce, desperate pride, building a wall of servitude around herself that was as formidable as his own wall of silence. His attention, however, was mostly fixed on the boy. Leo remained frail, trapped in the grip of the fever. Clara administered the medicine with religious devotion, her entire being focused on the small, shallow rise and fall of her son's chest. Arthur found himself watching, too, from a distance. He would leave a cup of fresh water by the cot before he left in the morning. He once returned with a handful of late-season berries he'd found in a sheltered patch, leaving them on the table without a word before retreating outside to mend a harness. He told himself it was for the sake of his investment. He had paid for the medicine, he wanted to see it work, but it was a lie, thin and brittle. Each time the boy coughed, a shard of memory pierced him. He saw Thomas, felt the helplessness, the rage at a world that would let a child suffer. He found he could not turn away from it a second time. One evening, he came back to the cabin to find Clara weeping silently, her face buried in her hands as she sat by the cot. Leo's breathing was shallow, his face pale and slick with sweat. The fever had spiked. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through Arthur. "Has he had the medicine?" he asked, his voice low. She looked up, her face a mask of despair. "Yes, it's not working. He won't wake up. He's so cold." Arthur moved to the cot, his usual distance forgotten. He laid a rough hand on the boy's forehead. It was clammy, but beneath the surface, a dangerous heat still radiated. He remembered Dr. Hale's words to his own wife years ago. "Break the fever. You have to sweat it out of him." He turned and began to stoke the fire, adding logs until it roared, filling the small cabin with an almost unbearable heat. "Get every blanket we have," he ordered. Clara, startled into action by the authority in his voice, scrambled to obey. They piled the blankets onto the small boy, their hands brushing in the frantic work. He then filled a basin with snow from outside and tore a strip from a clean flour sack. He sat on the edge of the cot, a place he had not allowed himself to be, and began bathing the boy's face and neck with the cold cloth. Clara knelt on the floor beside him, watching, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. For hours, they kept their vigil. Arthur didn't think, he only acted, moving with a grim muscle, deep memory of a task he had failed at once before. He was no longer Arthur Blackwood, the reclusive miner. He was a father fighting a familiar demon. Sometime in the deep, dark hours before dawn, it happened. A sheen of sweat broke out on Leo's forehead. It beaded on his skin, a miracle of moisture. His breathing deepened, losing some of its ragged edge. Arthur felt the shift, a subtle easing of the tension in the small body. He looked at Clara. Her eyes, wide and luminous in the firelight, were filled with tears, but this time they were not tears of despair. A single, choked sob escaped her. He stood up, his body stiff and aching. He had done all he could. He retreated to his pallet on the floor, leaving her with her son. He closed his eyes, but sleep did not come. He had crossed a line. He had stepped out of the shadows of his past and into the fragile, uncertain present of this woman and her child. The wall of his solitude had not just been breached, it had crumbled. The fever broke that night, and with its departure, something else began to shift in the quiet cabin. The taut wire of tension that had existed between Arthur and Clara slowly began to slacken. Leo, though still weak, was on the mend. Within a few days he was able to sit up, propped against the pillows, his large, curious eyes following Arthur's every move. Clara's servitude began to soften at the edges. She still worked tirelessly, but the rigid formality was replaced by a quiet watchfulness. She started leaving his dinner on the table instead of handing it to him with downcast eyes. She once dared to ask if the mine was yielding well. He answered with a simple, "Enough." It was the first conversation they had that was not born of immediate necessity. One afternoon, Arthur was outside sharpening the blade of his axe, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel, a familiar meditation. Leo, wrapped in a blanket, was sitting on the cabin stoop, watching him. Arthur finished his work and, without conscious thought, picked up a small block of pine from his woodpile. He took out his whittling knife and began to carve. His hands, though calloused and clumsy with heavy tools, remembered the gentler motions from long ago. He didn't look up, but he was aware of the boy's rapt attention. He carved the block into the rough shape of a horse, smoothing its edges, adding a flowing tail and a simple mane. It wasn't perfect. It was a crude, simple thing. When he was done, he held it for a moment, the smooth wood warm in his palm. It felt like an echo of a ghost. He had carved a dozen such animals for Thomas. He stood, walked over to the stoop, and placed the wooden horse in Leo's small, outstretched hand. He didn't say a word. He just turned and walked away, his heart hammering against his ribs. Later that evening, he saw the horse clutched in Leo's hand as he slept. The silence in the cabin changed. It was no longer a void, but a shared space. It was filled with the soft sounds of Leo's returning strength, the scratch of Arthur's pencil as he tallied his meager earnings, the quiet hum of Clara singing a lullaby. One evening, as a storm raged outside, rattling the windows and moaning through the pines, Clara spoke into the dim light of the fire. "My husband, his name was Samuel," she said, her voice soft. "He was a good man, a dreamer. He thought these mountains held a fortune for us. He wasn't built for the cold or the hardship." She paused, tracing a pattern on the rough wooden table. "The fever came on so fast. One week he was working his claim, the next he was gone." Arthur didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. He knew about fast, he knew about gone. After a long moment he spoke, his voice low and heavy. "My wife's name was Eleanor, my son was Thomas." It was not a story, just a statement. But in the small, warm cabin, with the storm raging outside, it was everything. It was an offering, a piece of his locked-away past, laid bare. He felt her gaze on him, but there was no pity in it, only a deep, quiet understanding. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He just nodded, unable to speak past the lump that had formed in his throat. In that moment, she was not his servant, and he was not her benefactor. They were two survivors, two people who understood the shape of the hole that loss leaves behind. As Leo grew stronger, a new energy filled the cabin. His laughter, at first weak and tentative, became a sound Arthur had not realized he had missed so desperately. The boy would follow him as he did his chores, asking endless questions about the mule, the trees, the rocks. Arthur found himself answering, his gruff responses slowly softening. The bargain was rarely mentioned, but it remained an unspoken foundation of their existence. Clara still worked as if to repay an impossible debt, and Arthur still held himself slightly apart, a man unused to the rhythms of a shared life. But the ground beneath them was shifting. He found himself looking for her when he returned from the mine, his day incomplete until he saw her face. She found herself watching for his familiar, broad-shouldered figure to emerge from the trees at dusk, a sense of relief settling over her when he was safely home. They were becoming a family, pieced together from broken parts, held together by a desperate promise and the slow, steady growth of something that felt dangerously like hope. Their fragile peace, however, was as tenuous as a sapling in a rock slide. The world they had hidden from had not forgotten them. Word had trickled down the mountain from Dr. Hale's office, passed along by the merchant Weston, and fermented in the stale air of the Carbon Creek saloon. The story twisted in the telling. The reclusive miner, Blackwood, had bought himself a woman. He was keeping her and her child captive up on his claim. The whispers were fueled by a mixture of boredom, envy, and a dark, predatory curiosity. One late afternoon, the trouble arrived. Arthur was splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady beat in the crisp air. Leo was nearby, arranging pebbles into a fortress while Clara was inside, likely preparing their evening meal. It was Arthur who heard it first, the sound of multiple horses, their hooves clumsy on the rocky trail. It was not the sound of a lone traveler. He straightened up, axe in hand, his body instantly tense. Through the trees, 3 riders emerged. He recognized them instantly. The man in the lead was Patrick Donovan, a miner with a reputation for bullying and a mean streak widened by whiskey. The two men with him were his usual shadows, men of similar character. They reined in their horses a short distance from the cabin, their eyes sweeping over the scene with a leering arrogance. "Well, well," Donovan called out, a smirk on his face. "Look what we have here, the hermit of Blackwood Mountain. Heard you'd found yourself some company." His gaze slid past Arthur to the cabin door, where Clara had just appeared, her face pale. Arthur tightened his grip on the axe handle. He moved, placing himself between the men and the cabin. "This is my claim, Donovan. You're not welcome here. State your business and leave." Donovan laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Business? We just came up for a social call. Heard you were employing a lady. Seemed neighborly to come and make sure she's being treated right." The insinuation was thick and ugly. He swung down from his horse, his men following suit. They began to advance slowly, spreading out. "She's fine," Arthur said, his voice a low growl. He didn't move, a solid, unyielding obstacle. "Turn around and ride out." "Now hold on," Donovan said, feigning concern. "We heard she was desperate. A man like you, all alone up here, it ain't right. Maybe the lady would prefer some different company." A choice. His eyes were fixed on Clara, who had frozen in the doorway, her hand on the frame to steady herself. Leo, sensing the danger, had scrambled to her side, hiding behind her skirts. This was the moment Arthur's past and present collided. For 5 years, he had been a man in retreat, a man who avoided conflict, who wanted nothing more than to be left alone with his ghosts. But looking at Clara's terrified face and the small boy peering out from behind her, he felt something else rise up in him, fierce, protective rage he had thought long dead. These men were not just trespassing on his land, they were threatening his home, they were threatening the fragile peace he had only just begun to find. "She made her choice," Arthur said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And her choice is to be left alone by scum like you." Donovan's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl. Big words for a man who hides on a mountain. He took another step forward. "We just want to talk to the lady, alone." It was then that Clara moved. She stepped out from the doorway, pulling Leo behind her, and walked to stand beside Arthur. It was a simple act, but it was an earthquake. She raised her chin, her fear warring with a defiant strength Arthur had never seen in her before. "I am here of my own free will," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing with conviction in the mountain air. "This man saved my son's life. He has shown me more kindness than your entire town put together. You will leave this place, now." Her courage stunned the men into a moment of silence. It also ignited a fire in Arthur. To see her stand with him, to hear her defend him, it solidified everything. He was no longer just protecting them, they were protecting each other. Donovan recovered, his face flushing with anger and humiliation. "Kindness, is that what you call it?" he sneered. "Looks more like you bought yourself a slave, Blackwood." He lunged forward, reaching for Clara. Arthur moved faster than he had in years. He didn't swing the axe to harm, he swung it like a shield. He brought the heavy, flat side of the blade around in a powerful arc, smashing it into Donovan's outstretched arm. There was a sickening crunch of bone and a howl of pain. Donovan staggered back, clutching his arm, his face a mask of shock and agony. His two companions, who had been advancing, stopped dead in their tracks, their bravado evaporating at the sight of their leader writhing on the ground. Arthur stood over him, the axe held ready, his eyes burning with a cold fire. He was no gunslinger, but he was a man forged by hardship, his body hardened by years of swinging a pickaxe into solid rock. He was part of the mountain itself, implacable and dangerous when provoked. "I told you to leave," Arthur said, his voice resonating with a power that shook the remaining men. "There are blasting charges set all around this clearing. One wrong step, one more move toward this cabin, and I'll send you all to meet your maker in 1,000 little pieces. Now get him on his horse and get off my land before I change my mind." Whether it was a bluff or not, they didn't wait to find out. The threat, combined with Arthur's raw ferocity and the sight of Donovan's shattered arm, was enough. They scrambled to haul their groaning leader onto his saddle and beat a hasty retreat, their flight clumsy and panicked. They disappeared back into the trees, leaving behind only the echo of their hoofbeats and the lingering stench of their fear. The silence that descended was profound. Arthur stood for a long moment, the adrenaline coursing through him, the axe still heavy in his hand. He could feel his heart pounding, a wild drum against his ribs. He had not felt this alive, this present in his own skin, for 5 long years. Slowly, he lowered the axe. He turned to look at Clara. She was staring at him, her eyes wide, her hand covering her mouth. Leo was still clinging to her dress, his face buried in its folds. The air between them was charged with everything that had just happened and everything that had been left unsaid for weeks. The brutal confrontation had stripped away all pretense. It had laid them bare. He wasn't her master, and she wasn't his servant. They were partners who had just faced down a common enemy, a man and a woman who had stood together to defend their home. The immediate danger was gone, but the aftermath lingered in the twilight, thick and potent. Arthur finally let the axe drop to the ground with a soft thud. He felt a tremor run through his hands, the last of the battle rage leaving him. He looked at the cabin, the warm light spilling from its window, at the woman and child standing before it, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would have died before letting those men touch them. Clara took a hesitant step toward him. "Arthur," she began, her voice barely a whisper. She stopped, seemingly unable to find the words. The name, spoken without the filter of fear or obligation, sounded new. He met her gaze, and in that long, silent look, the last remnants of their bargain dissolved. The debt had been paid, not with labor, but with loyalty. Not with servitude, but with shared courage. The cold, hard pact made in desperation had been reforged in fire into something else entirely, something warm and strong and unnamed. He stooped to pick up the axe, his movements slow and weary. He walked to the woodpile and set it down, his back to her. "Go inside," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Get the boy warm. I'll be in shortly." She hesitated for only a moment before obeying, gathering Leo into her arms and disappearing into the safety of the cabin. Arthur stood alone in the gathering dark, listening to the wind sigh through the pines. He was no longer a man in hiding. He was a man standing guard. The ghosts of his past were still there, but they were quieter now, their sorrowful whispers drowned out by the fierce, protective beat of his own living heart. Later that night, long after Leo was asleep, the silence in the cabin was different. It was not the companionable quiet of recent weeks, but a space filled with unspoken truths, waiting to be given voice. Arthur sat at the table, cleaning his rifle, a task that required no thought. Clara sat across from him, mending a tear in Leo's small shirt, her stitches neat and even. Finally, she set her sewing aside. "The men from town, they won't be back, will they?" she asked, her voice low. "No," Arthur said, not looking up from his work. "Donovan won't forget this. The fear will keep them away." Another silence stretched between them. It was Clara who broke it again. "My bargain with you," she started, her voice faltering. "I promised to be your servant for life." Arthur stopped his work. He carefully laid the rifle and the cleaning cloth on the table and finally looked at her. Her face was earnest in the lamplight, her eyes searching his. "That bargain ended today, Clara," he said, his voice gentle. "It ended the moment you stood beside me." Relief washed over her face, but it was quickly followed by uncertainty. "Then, what am I to do? Where are we to go? We have nothing." This was the question that had been hanging over them. He had known it was coming. He had thought about it all evening, out in the cold starlight. He had thought about the empty silence returning, the cabin growing cold again, the ghosts creeping back from the corners. The thought was unbearable. "You're free to go," he said, and the words felt like stones in his mouth. When the snow clears, I can take you to another town, somewhere further south. Give you what little money I have to get you started." He was offering her an escape, an honorable release, but every part of him screamed in protest. She stared at him, her expression unreadable. She looked around the small, rough-hewn cabin. It was not a palace. It was a shelter against the harshness of the world, built by a broken man. But in the past weeks, she had made it a home. She had swept out more than just the dust. She had swept out the lingering despair. "And what if I don't want to go?" she asked quietly, her gaze returning to his, direct and unwavering. "What if my son and what if we have found the only place we wish to be?" Arthur's heart, a thing he had thought incapable of anything but hurting, seemed to swell in his chest. Hope, tentative and fragile, unfurled within him. He saw not a servant, but an equal. A woman of immense strength and quiet grace, a partner. "This isn't much of a life," he said, the caution of a long-suffering man still in his voice. "The work is hard, the winters are long, there is no fortune here." A small, true smile touched her lips for the first time. "It is more than I have had in a very long time," she said. "It is warmth, it is safety, it is a home." She paused, her smile fading into something more profound. "If you will have us." The choice was his. He could retreat back into the safety of his grief, or he could step forward into the terrifying, beautiful uncertainty of a shared future. He looked past her, to the cot where Leo slept peacefully, the small wooden horse still clutched in his hand. He looked back at Clara, her face illuminated by the warm lamplight, and saw not the spectre of his lost Eleanor, but a new beginning. "I will have you," he said, and the words were a vow, more binding than any desperate bargain. From that day forward, the cabin on Blackwood Mountain was transformed. The arrangement of master and servant was buried, along with the ghosts of the past. Arthur and Clara became partners, navigating the small shared spaces of their life with a growing ease and tenderness. They worked side by side, their days marked by a rhythm of mutual support. He worked the mine, and she made their small claim a true home, her laughter and Leo's bright energy chasing the last shadows from the corners. The seasons turned. The harsh winter gave way to a green and vibrant spring. The land, once a symbol of Arthur's isolation and penance, became a place of shared discovery and quiet joy. They were no longer two broken souls clinging to the wreckage of their lives, but a family built on a foundation of unexpected kindness, forged in shared adversity and sustained by a love that had grown. Quiet and steady, in the most unlikely of places. The mountain that had been his prison had become their sanctuary.